Hey everybody, I've got a question. Is obedience legalism? So let's look at the word. First question to answer. Should we obey? And I think the obvious answer is yes, we should obey. God calls us to obey in many places. Jesus himself said in John 14, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Ecclesiastes, at the end of Ecclesiastes, the preacher says, here's the whole conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is man's honor. This is the whole duty of man. And John in the New Testament, much later on after the resurrection, he says, "He who says, 'I know him,' and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him." Strong words. Chapter 5 of 1 John. He says, "By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments." In verse 3, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." James goes even further, and he says concerning the law, "For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all." So the idea here is if you're keeping 9 of the 10 commandments, you're guilty of breaking them all. And it kind of makes sense, I suppose. Think about it, just in our minds. If you say, "Well, I keep all the commandments except I bow down and I worship idols." Well, aren't you already breaking the first commandment? And maybe you're breaking the third commandment, to not take the Lord's name in vain. If you're taking his name as a Christian, but then it's in vain because you're bowing down to idols. So you can see that what he has to say really makes sense. So yes, we're to obey. So are we saved then by grace, by faith, by works? How does that all fit together? James goes on just a few verses later in verse 20, and he says, "But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead?" So they go together, they're combined. Do you remember the little story that Jesus told after he preached? And he said, the one who hears my words and does them is like a man who builds his house on a rock. But the one who hears my words and doesn't do them is like a man who builds his house on the sand. Aha! So there's something very important about not just hearing the word and believing it, but also following through and doing something about it. Paul said to Titus in Titus 3:8, "Those who have believed in God should be careful to maintain good works. These things are good and profitable to men." And Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works." Aha! So here it is, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. When we're created in Christ Jesus, a new creation, we've been created to do good works. When we're in Christ, we're saved. We're not saved because we do good works. We're saved to do good works. And think about it. If sin is lawlessness, if sin is the transgression of the law, and we're saved from sin, what are we saved from? We're saved from transgressing the law. We're saved from being lawless. We're saved unto good works. We're created in Christ unto good works. And doesn't this make sense? So then, let's look at this. Strong's Concordance tells us in Strong's Topical Concordance here, I've got the Strong's 21st Century Edition, and here's what it says under legalism: "Seeking God's favor by keeping the letter of the law without keeping its spirit." Let's look at a few examples of that right in the Bible. Do you remember the story that Jesus told of 2 men who were doing the same thing? They were both praying. They were both, what would you say? They're both doing good works. I think prayer is a good work. But look how this Pharisee is praying. Was it really good at all? No, it wasn't good. They were both doing the same thing, but the heart was in the wrong place. This guy, this Pharisee, was seeking favor, God's favor or man's favor, by thinking, "Oh God, thank you that I'm not like these other men. Look how good I am." And this other guy, this tax collector, was just beating his chest, and all he could do was just say, God, be merciful to me. Was he seeking God's favor? Absolutely. But it wasn't by keeping the law. It was by being humble and submissive. How about the story of the widow and her mite that she throws into the collector's tin or whatever, and the other people were pouring out bags of money just to receive favor, either from God or from man. And here she is putting in basically everything that she has. What a difference in the heart. Legalism is about the heart. How about when the disciples were walking with Jesus through the grain fields, and the Pharisees saw them plucking the heads of grain and eating them, but it was the Sabbath day. You can't do that on the Sabbath day. You're working. Oh my goodness. The Jews had hundreds of extra laws that they added to these 10 commandments. For instance, concerning the Sabbath. You know, in their agricultural society, it was a law that you can't spit on the Sabbath day. Well, how would that, why would that be, you might ask? Well, if you were to spit, it might land on a plant. And then you'd be watering on the Sabbath. And that's a no-no. So this is legalism. Should we obey the Sabbath commandment along with the other 9? Yes, but not in that spirit. Is obedience legalism? Not necessarily. Is seeking God's favor by keeping the letter of the law legalism? Absolutely. And there's a big difference. Here's another example about Jesus. And he was accused of breaking the Sabbath. When he healed a man on the Sabbath, he told the man to take up his bed and walk. This guy takes up this little mat and he walks away, and the guy gets in trouble because he was working on the Sabbath day. What a disgrace. So we are to do works. But legalism is not just obeying. Legalism is the heart. It has much more to do with the heart. Aren't we saved by grace? And what does Scripture say? Look at what Romans 6:1 says. Paul making an argument in chapter 5, and we start read in chapter 6. He says this: "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it?" So shall we sin in order that grace may abound? No. When we have been crucified with Christ and resurrected into newness of life, and think about baptism and being buried in that watery grave of baptism and coming up into newness of life, we are saying, I have been... Well, let's just read it. Let's see what Paul says here in a second. First, I want to ask you this question. Was Jesus a legalist for obeying? Did he not obey? He said himself in John 5:30, "I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me." Was he a legalist because he wanted to obey God and do what he said? Of course not. Was Jesus a legalist because in Gethsemane he fell prostrate to the ground and he cried out to his Father, saying, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will"? Was he a legalist for obeying and surrendering to the Father? Was he a legalist for laying down and surrendering his life? Absolutely not. He wasn't a legalist because he obeyed. He was a submissive, surrendering son to his Father and obeying, and his heart was in the right place. And that's the thing about legalism. The thing about legalism is legalism happens when our heart is in the wrong place, not when our actions are in the wrong place. I can't say it any better than Paul said it himself in Galatians 2:20. This is the goal for us all. I've been crucified with Christ, Paul says. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. When Christ lives in us, he's going to live his life, his obedient life in us. John 4:24, Jesus said this to the woman at the well. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Should we obey? Yes. Should we obey in the right spirit? Absolutely. You know, friends, someday we're going to be in heaven. By God's grace, I hope that we're all there. When we're there will be no disobedience, and there will be no legalism either. People who love God will serve him out of love and not out of legalism.